Hello, friends. Bob Monkhouse here, welcoming you to Through the Square Window, presented by Samira Ahmed and Graham Kibble-White. I'm told that in this month's episode, they'll be reviewing my game show, Bob's Full House. Do they have my card marked? Is my number up? Am I about to be walled? Let's listen and find out.
This is a podcast guiding you through the UK television we watched in decades gone by.
And today we're looking at what was on TV this month 41 years ago in November 1984.
Right, a bit about ourselves. My mother and I have both worked as TV presenters. I present Newswatch on BBC One. And once, when my children were really young, she told me that they weren't watching enough television. No such worries when she was raising me, obviously, Graham.
That's incredible. That's what you want to hear. I'm the Telegraph's head of TV and radio. And to my deep shame, Samira, I once had a scuffle with a very good friend in a charity shop when we both noticed at the same time an autographed copy of Bob Monkhouse's autobiography, Crying with Laughter. Now, I have to say, I pushed him out of the way. I'm a bit taller than him, and I prevailed. And so the book is mine, and as you'll hear shortly, I've consulted it for today's episode.
Is he still your friend?
He is still my friend. I'm not sure he's ever forgiven me.
Well, time to look at our postbag now, Graham. And last month we looked at the pilot episode of the Mary Whitehouse Experience from 1990, and that prompted Jim Hanna to get in touch.
Yes, Jim has a very interesting take actually on the formation of the series. He writes, the Mary Whitehouse team hadn't grown together, they were Frankenstein by the BBC. So obviously when you see the tweedy beaters of Steve and Hugh, fresh from a regular spot in Jasper Carrot's show, and the two sexy alphas of David Baddiel and Rob Newman, the quartet had no chemistry at all.
So this is all his opinion, and he continues, you could feel the audience not getting the alphas preening and showing off, and there were awkward silences at key points. It was at times genuinely embarrassing, especially in the first series. I remember before series 2 they declared that they had now got a handle on the TV medium, which felt, even at the time, like an admission of sorts. What they had got a handle on was catchphrase comedy, and in the end, that's all they amounted to. Harsh, eh?
I think that's a little bit harsh, but it's certainly an interesting analysis. Now, we also heard from John Williams, who's the co-host of the excellent World of Telly podcast, who dropped us a line about our item on BBC One's Watchdog, saying, whenever I think about that show, I'm haunted by the Pop-Tart episode with all the many victims crowded into TV Centre to tell their stories. Ouch.
And Russell Parker, who in truth did say nice things about us, also wanted to take issue with me for describing 1990s Nightmare with a K as the early days of blue screen chroma key. Oh God, I knew someone would pick me up on that.
Well, I think I read that as you were saying it was the early days of doing that in an interactive environment. Let's say that's the caveat.
Absolutely. Obviously, there'd been chroma key used in film and television earlier, but like it was seeing it used in that way as a big selling point of the show. So, but thank you, Russell, for keeping me on my toes.
And we're very proud to have this kind of informed listener out there as well. And then lastly, still on the subject of Nightmare with a K, as we're now obliged to refer to it. Has to be. Jim Sangster contacted us on Blue Sky to say he once had a tiny role in an audio play with Nightmare with a K's Hugo Myatt, who claimed that if the kids were boring on the show, they'd lead them into an unwinnable room where they'd be hacked apart by chainsaws. But then he did qualify that with, no, not really.
Oh, good. I'm relieved to hear that. I don't want to hear that it was rigged. If you want to contact the podcast, you can reach us on email at squarewindow.co.uk or search for Square Window Pod on X or Blue Sky.
Here's what we're going to be talking about today.
The next train at platform 3 is for Guildford via Cobham.
I mind about this one. So just do your best, okay?
There is also the question of trespass and breaking and entering.
Well, we are not encouraged to use our initiative, and methinks this state of affairs should change.
That was Return to Waterloo, Juliet Bravo, The Gentle Touch, and the last ever episode of Rentaghost.
But to begin, it's eyes down, everyone. So that theme tune, sheer excitement pouring out of the screen, heralded the start of Bob's Full House, which aired at 6:40pm on Saturday 3rd of November on BBC One. Having only launched that September, the show was hosted by Bob Monkhouse and pitted 4 players against each other, attempting to answer general knowledge questions to complete their electronic bingo cards.
And the ultimate winner would go on to play for a holiday plus a cash prize. And it should be said, this is the show that gifted us catchphrases such as "You're Wallied" and arguably TV's greatest ever, "In bingo lingo clickety clicks, it's time to take your pick of the 6." I also have to make a huge confession here, Graham. Despite the fact that I love television, I have never watched this before preparing for this podcast. I was aware of it, and I have to say, it was brilliant. It was so fast-paced. The studio revolves around to reveal the gifts. I thought Bob Monkhouse was glib. The jokes were often scripted, but they felt sharp and he was quick to respond. And I laughed out loud at how much I enjoyed this show.
What were you expecting?
I tried not to have too many assumptions. I guess I had the idea of Bob Monkhouse from all those comedy shows where he was always being mocked as being, sort of snide and slick and a bit bland and a bit weird. And you just realise he's a professional. Like, you can't really tell what kind of personality he has. He's kind of a slightly weird person, isn't he? He's a person who only exists in television. A bit like, I suppose, he's like Alan Partridge, because he doesn't even have any giveaways about his politics or anything. And he's got that weird permatan. But the first thing I did notice was the set, which has the contestants on stage, they're sort of staggered on 2 steps. And I thought, this looks like blankety blank. And there is a blankety blank connection, is there not?
Yes, there is a connection, which is that Bob's Full House was created by Terry Mardell and David Moore, who wrote the warm-ups for Wogan's blankety blank. So clearly they've been there in the sidelines observing, I would say, a pretty solid and a pretty fast-paced game show and how it comes together. And they've gone off and formulated a show that I would argue is an even greater exponent of the TV quiz show. I think a lot of producers today could learn a lot from Bob's Full House and the way it kind of runs.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that, because I love that the questions are actually quite highbrow. So there's always a social history element of, there's lots of questions about Gilbert and Sullivan. There's a question about Visconti's film The Leopard. They don't get it right. They don't know who the star of it was, which is Burt Lancaster. But the history questions, and Indrani, who is the standout contestant, it's actually quite a strong field. She's of Sri Lankan heritage. She's the British history buff. And it's like a test of British citizenship that she knows more than any British-born person would know. I was astounded at her knowledge. I wrote down things she got right. The new head of the TUC, Christopher Columbus's nationality, which of course is, Graham?
Don't ask me. Spanish?
Italian. No, people think he's Spanish. He was Italian. And she knows what flag ships had to fly when they were leaving harbour, which is the Blue Peter.
Yeah, I mean, it is incredible because there's such a weird mix of things going on here. And you're right in terms of highbrow, lowbrow, gags, some quite, I would say, slightly crude gags, but with Bob sort of leaning into this persona as kind of an ageing Lothario.
Tell me about yourself. What's your full name?
Juliet.
Where do you come from?
St Ives in Cornwall.
That's a very healthy part of the world, and you're a very, very attractive lady, and I would like to get to know you better. Are you married?
Yes, I am.
Oh, you what a shame. What does he do for sport?
He's a rugby player.
Does he really?
Yes, he's flirting with Julie, isn't he?
He's flirting with Julie, which is slightly painful, one of the contestants. But, I mean, he is described at the top of the show as the master of the house. And he just is. It's like, he's like a cyborg. This is man and format meshed together as one. This such kind of vigour and confidence. There are off-colour jokes. There is the flirtation. There is his slightly awkward conversation, with this Sri Lankan contestant.
But you can't pronounce her name.
Yes,
but
exactly.
Then he lets it go. It's over.
And so many things come in and sort of float away again. And he just feels like he doesn't miss a single trick.
I agree.
Did you? I mean, he does make some unfortunate gags. Did any of them concern you?
The one that bothered me was not bothered me, but it was a bit weird. Was the one about flirting with Julie.
Yeah.
But I thought the one about Enoch Powell was quite interesting.
Yes, let's hear that one actually.
Who said you can have any colour you like, provided it's black?
Henry Ford.
Henry Ford said it. It wasn't Enoch Powell. We know that, don't we? So.
And then there's also an apartheid joke about the piano keys, isn't there? Being the black keys being at one end and the white keys being at the other end.
Yeah.
I mean, I thought in a way, isn't it great that the political world events are getting a mention in a light entertainment context? I'm sure these things would be absolutely verboten now.
And you think about when it was going out, this is Saturday night as well. This is it's the broadest audience that the BBC is going to get. And yet, I'm not going to call it subversive. It's not trying to be subversive, is it? But it's trying to be engaging in a way that maybe slightly transcends a quiz show. Is that a fair comment?
I think what's interesting is the gameplay is genuinely fast-paced and exciting. You can pick up the game straight away, but you can't take your concentration away for a second. They've all got different bingo cards on the front of the desk, and they have to choose numbers. There's a trivia round, which reminds me a bit of Pointless, where you can choose categories.
Yeah.
And then you have to pick a number that is in one of those categories. There's a lot of stuff that people have to be multi-skilled at doing, and I particularly love that it's got one of those electronic display boards that they also used on a show like Family Fortunes, which it generates the letters or the numbers very quickly, and it actually is very satisfying watching that. It's a kind of analog version of digital technology. And they even use it to play the end credits of the show. They make a real virtue of this is an expensive set. And can I just mention the white goods? Because a film like Time Bandits, which was only 2 years earlier, was really mocking game shows and the white goods aspiration. But the stuff on here, like there's a stereo with a TV and speakers and everything, that Indrani wins and she goes for it. And you just think, that looks amazing. I mean, these were really nice pieces of stuff to have in your house.
I mean, the other thing that surprised me about it was because the thing really chugs along and it really runs like clockwork, except there is a sort of looseness in the edit as well. So we have people buzzing in randomly all the time. Yes. And there are a couple of occasions which they could have snipped where the game sort of comes off the rails a bit, when Indrani tries to buzz in on a multiple choice question when all the wrong answers have been eliminated, and Bob has to kind of deal with that. And there's also then this sublime moment where there's a contestant, Alan, who has won an award of a bunch of flowers to arrive on his birthday every year for the next 5 years.
You suffer from hay fever. We're giving you a bunch of flowers. And I'll tell you what, it's not just a bunch of flowers now, it's a bunch of flowers every year on your birthday for 5 years.
The other thing which I thought was hilarious was there is this whole, the ultimate final round is you can win cash, but you're really going for the prize of the holiday, and it's going to be an exotic, and the letters start to appear and you can guess where the destination is. And the only letdown to winning this exciting holiday for two in Morocco is the terrible, terrible photographs in that sort of montage sequence where they show you what she's won.
Yeah.
It looks like a really bad postcard from the sort of early 70s.
I mean, that end game, you get these gear changes, don't you, all the way through Bob's Full House. And what fascinates me is, I think in later series, Bob himself was one of the question writers. So he was credited for writing the questions. But you really get a sense in his autobiography, the one that I wrestled off Ian Jones. Sorry, Ian.
Give us the quote then.
He talks a bit about how they put this thing on its feet. So he says that 2 pilots were made, and in the second, Bob recalls that I loaded the show with gags, opening monologue, funny interviews with the 4 players, apt one-line joke after every answer. Then I dropped the comedy for the third knockout round using 3-word questions. I love the specificity of that. 3-word questions. It's all about pacing to build up speed. He says it ran for 6 years, attracting the highest ratings, and I adored it.
This is going to be exciting. Playing for a dream holiday. 15 numbers there on your gold card. They're hidden there. Some are worth cash, others hide the letters that spell the golden holiday. So let's flash the figures and make them big ones, please.
And actually, of the end game, he says they tried a few different end games where initially I think contestants were going to be going up against each other. But he says, I prefer the end game of a quiz to have the host on screen with a single contestant in a suspenseful climax. And this is the important bit, with its timing under my control. So he really is aware of the grammar. And I guess a quiz show is about timing, isn't it? That's what it comes down to in the end.
We got an interesting message on Blue Sky from Darren Lethley, who said bingo was very big in the 80s. For example, Captain Bob Maxwell using it as a spearhead against the sun at the Mirror, presumably. Did Bob's Full House anticipate, drive or hitch its coattails to that popularity?
I think it might be the latter, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. The original idea was that this was going to be live, Bob's Full House, and there was going to be a bingo card in Radio Times, and so that viewers could play along as well. Although I'm sort of glad they didn't do that, because I think the pacing would have suffered. But yes, and it feels to me like this is a format that could work today with actually very little tweaking. My one question is Bob the integral part of that format?
The thing about Monkhouse is, even at the time, there was something quite, like you mentioned him being like a bit like a cyborg, there's something not quite 100% human about him. And I think it was that he was so dedicated to television that he was actually a super nerd. And that was part of it. And I remember when he died, it turned out he had this massive, massive collection in a garage of videotapes. He used to tape everything off television. And I know his family then tried to ask the BFI, would they take it on and, use it as an archive? And they said, we haven't got the resources. So Missing Believed Wipe took it on. But there's something about the man being obsessed with how to make great television. And I think in that sense, he was integral to this show.
I think so. One other thing I just wanted to drop in, which was a few years ago, I interviewed Bob's co-writer, Colin Edmonds, who worked with him for decades. And incidentally, I should say that Colin himself started his career working on Whizzer and Chips comic, which is a detail I like very much.
That's a great detail.
But I asked him, there's this oft-repeated fact about Bob that in later series, Bob's cue cards after each question simply read joke, and he would improvise a gag on the spot. Now, it's a nice story, but actually Colin confirmed it's not true. He told me that Bob liked to be across every angle. He didn't like to leave any gaps. He liked to be the master of every aspect of the show, whereas great comics with funny bones like Tommy Cooper and Eric Morecambe and Jimmy Tarbuck can go and busk it and freewheel it. Bob didn't have funny bones, but he worked very, very hard on his comedy.
Didn't he get one of his joke books stolen in the
He did.
early 90s? It was a huge nightmare for him, wasn't it?
There was a lot of low, nasty coverage about that.
Well, was it perhaps this is the era when alternative comedy means everyone's supposed to sound like they're improvising, even though, as we know from the Mary Whitehouse experience, these were long worked-out routines and things, almost like essays. And somehow he represents an old-fashioned way of doing things, and that was part of what people were reacting against, in perhaps an overly simplistic and dismissive way.
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think this kind of slickness that he had to him, and he was very aware of that, and that it could switch some people off. And I did actually, the very first person I ever interviewed was Bob Monkhouse, which was a phone interview shortly before he died, but we were talking about The Golden Shot, and he did say that in some ways that was the best ever format, because so many things would go wrong on that show that it would sort of take the edge off his professionalism and make him seem a bit more likeable, that he was having to deal with all these hiccups and stuff when he normally came across as so slick and together.
It's interesting.
Now, what was going on culturally in November 1984?
In the pop charts at number 1, Freedom by Wham, I Feel For You by Chaka Khan, and I Should Have Known Better by Jim Diamond.
While in the cinema, releases included The Company of Wolves, A Private Function, The Karate Kid, which I know is a big one for you, Samira.
I saw it twice in the cinema.
The Killing Fields, and of course Paul McCartney's Give My Regards to Broad Street, which was one of the strangest follies in British cinema. And we're going to at one point work out some excuse for us to both just do a whole episode about Macca somehow or other.
Macca's Telly Adventures,
yes.
Excellent idea. Well, Mike Reed was our Radio 1 breakfast show host, while Terry Wogan was drawing near the end of his first stint presiding over the mornings on Radio 2. That was a snippet of the opening music of Return to Waterloo, a one-off hour-long drama that aired on Channel 4 on Friday the 2nd of November at 9 p.m. And it was written and directed by Ray Davies of The Kinks, who of course wrote Waterloo Sunset. And it tells the story of the traveller, a lone commuter played by Kenneth Colley, as he fantasises on his weekday's train journey from Guildford to Waterloo. Oh my God, this was such a terrible piece of television. And it's Channel 4 experimental, I guess, is the excuse. Graham, tell us about this monstrosity.
Yeah, well, I mean, Ray Davies, and I'm a huge Ray Davies fan.
Me too.
He's always flirted with these kind of multimedia experiments. And in terms of, if we're just talking about art anyway, as soon as I hear something as a multimedia art installation, my heart slightly drops. That maybe says more about me than the art world. And for example, in 1974, Ray had written and starred in a show called Star Maker for Granada TV, which was about a man who, is he a big famous star, or is it all in his head? And this is a sort of similar thing. I think it was inspired by Ray's own commute from Guildford to Waterloo. And in a 1985 MTV documentary about this, because this was quite a big deal, Ray explained that the traveller is returning to his own past every day as he travels back into London. And of the character, the traveller, who never speaks, he says he's one of my silent majority, and likens him to the well-respected man. And I suppose this is my point, is that I find it interesting that Ray Davies has never been shy about revisiting his own work, and does it quite a lot. I mean, even Waterloo Sunset, the melody of that he's using in another song, Lavender Lane. Does that bother you, or do you think that's fair game, that he can go and pillage his own work, and particularly the peaks of his own works for other pieces?
I think it's absolutely fine that he can do that, as long as what he makes is worth seeing. And this was, I mean, we should say that the premise of this fantasy is the man fantasizes that he's a serial rapist. And so there's lots of shots of him following women around the trains, and his photo fit. There's a photo fit of the suspect that seems to be him, and you just think, why would that be something you want to fantasize about? I also am going to come out here and say, I think there's a really interesting parallel between this and Give My Regards to Broad Street, which was, Paul McCartney's film, in which there's a whole fantasy sequence when he's talking about being a little boy, and there's a whole scene in a kind of dance hall with ballroom dancers and kind of teddy boys coming in and attacking each other. And here you've got this little boy. It's something about 60s rock stars. I guess they're all about 40 at this point, aren't they? And I think they're kind of having a midlife crisis on screen. It's my theory. It's
very strange, and it makes me think, I mean, Ray Davies has always mined quite a thin array of topics. A lot of them is about commuters or childhood or nostalgia. And whereas I think in his music that works really well, I feel that maybe what we're learning here is that his concerns in song don't work as concerns on film. There's just not enough there, do you think?
Yeah, although, I mean, filmically, it's actually really interesting because it is all shot on or around trains. So, one, I live on this commuter line, so I'm really aware of all the tannoy announcements and the platforms and the hoardings. And there's an awful lot of people, being on board a moving train, and then they're communicating or passing something to someone on the platform. It's shot from multiple perspectives. It must have been very complicated to shoot. There's a whole sequence with two elderly women getting on a train or off a train just before it leaves. And, you think you can't just reset that shot if you didn't get it right first time. So technically it feels like it's very Channel 4, but it just shows you that being technically innovative and being willing to experiment with these film formats, which is what Channel 4 really pioneered, and then the BBC would copy. It didn't necessarily mean the content was worth having. What I will say is Kenneth Colley, who plays the unspeaking commuter, I recognised him straight away because he was Admiral Pete, commander of Darth Vader's executor craft in the Star Wars sequels, The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. And he's a really fascinating actor. Apparently, sadly, he only died in July this year. And I just think he's got a great presence. He's a bit like Jonathan Pryce. He's got that kind of face, that kind of expression to him.
Yeah, he's perfectly cast in this, isn't he? Because even though he doesn't have any dialogue, he's quite mesmeric, isn't he, in terms of how he reacts to things. And
it's the whole Dennis Potter thing, isn't it, on one of the trains where he's sitting opposite three male businessmen all reading journals about business things. So there's a kind of vaguely, sort of, I don't know if you'd call it an anti-Slatcher thing, but a thing about yuppie culture.
Yeah.
And then there is a group of sort of new wave young people, yobbos, who get on, one of whom is Tim Roth, who is so thrilling to watch, even in a really dodgy piece of filmmaking.
Do you know what I do with people like this? I put them up against a wall and I blow their bloody heads off.
Yeah, he just stands out. And there's a woman with him who looks a bit like Susie Sue, and they're basically, she's trying to flirt with, it's just awful. She tries to flirt with Kenneth Colley and then pushes him off and gobs at him or something. I mean, it's just, it just was a mess.
Something I found interesting when I was digging into this is, this might sound unlikely, but Ray Davies actually took advice from Martin Scorsese when he was making
Clearly not
this.
enough advice.
He asked him, how do you make a low-budget film? And the advice he got was visualise every shot in advance so that you could really make it count. So actually, Ray Davies created this as a storyboard before it was a final script. And I wonder if some of the issues there are endemic. Because, as you say, some of the shots and things are very nice.
There's a great moment where he's leaning out of a window and his childhood self in kind of wartime shorts and jumper standing on the platform, and he's handing over a bunch of keys to this boy. I mean, moments like that, they're very visual. There's also a lot of cameos. There's Claire Rayner as his agony aunt, who plays herself, and Michael Fish as well.
There's an interesting moment, isn't there, where the tannoy announcer at Waterloo then kind of segues into writing a letter to Claire Rayner, which we can also listen to that.
The next train at platform 3 is for Guildford via Cobham, calling at Hinchley Wood, Claygate, Oxshott, Cobham, Effingham Junction and Dear Claire. I never thought the time would come when I would write to you after 18 years of happy marriage. But about a month ago, our daughter left home, and since then, something seems to have changed. I'm now beginning to suspect that for some time my husband has been seeing another woman. Lately, I feel there have been secrets between us.
Is that supposed to be his lonely wife writing about her marriage?
Well, I think this is the problem, isn't it? Because I think when you make something which is so kind of elliptical and diffuse and nothing is pinned down, I think it portends at a profundity that sort of isn't there. And I think even Ray Davies himself probably couldn't nail down who is what and what is going on. I mean, one of the things that's really strange, and it's not the first time that he's kind of gone into this territory in his career, is the relationship between our commuter and his daughter, which seems... what's the delicate way we could describe this, Samira?
Well, is there a sense of she's leaving home, you know? So there's an empty nest thing, but there's also an incest scenario that he's...
But this sort of tinge of a sexual overtone. I mean, I don't know if he thinks it's being subversive or it's interesting, but I find it just a bit uncomfortable and unresolved.
It just crosses a line, doesn't it? It just doesn't work. I think it's interesting that this is only the year before Julian Temple's Absolute Beginners, in which Ray Davies had an excellent cameo and wrote an original song about a quiet life. So I think, and I'm going to make the comparison again, I think like Paul McCartney's Give My Regards to Broad Street, a talent that benefited on a film project when he wasn't in total control, when actually someone else very experienced was leading it. And I'll come back to how much misogynistic material is still getting mainstream airtime this late in the 80s under the guise of it being art, and the male genius given creative free rein like Dennis Potter.
The last thing that comes to my mind about this also is that, you know, we know that Ray Davies was an art school graduate, and it feels to me like an art school film, and in terms of it's sort of, you know, the sense of someone has this opportunity and they're sort of trying to do everything with it and throw everything at it, and it ends up not really being anything. And actually, the weird thing is the songs aren't good enough.
No, the songs are pretty weak.
We're at a point in Ray Davies's career where he is consciously, perhaps he's bored of the kind of, you know, the verse chorus construction, and he tries to do something a bit more baroque, and actually all of it's just quite tiresome.
Well, it's trying to be a bit Ken Russell or a bit Quadrophenia, isn't it? And it doesn't, you realise that it's neither.
Time to see what was performing well in the ratings. BBC One's most watched show of November 1984 was the Royal Variety Performance with 20.5 million viewers. Other reliables included the brilliant Tenko with figures of around 15 million.
And we will have to talk about that one day. It's one of my favourite shows ever made. Sitcom, Just Good Friends, that was also around 15 million. Heidi High was at 14.5 million. While two shows we are talking about today regularly featured in the channel's top 10. Juliet Bravo at around 11.5 million, and Bob's Full House, normally scoring around 11 million, both on BBC One.
And on ITV as ever, Coronation Street dominated, with figures peaking at 20 million, but game shows Give Us a Clue, and I love that, by the way, and Play Your Cards Right.
Oh God, yes.
Performed well with 16 and 14 million respectively. The 18 was also solid, around 13.5 million, and it's worth mentioning ITV's Saturday night rival to Juliet Bravo, The Gentle Touch, actually regularly outperformed it by around about 2 million viewers, with ratings in the region of 13 million.
And in TV news, Thames TV was returning to a full service after a 3-week strike by the Association of Cinematograph, Television and Allied Technicians. But they were also celebrating 2 Emmy wins for the sitcom Fresh Fields in the popular arts category and The Wind in the Willows for children's programmes. And meanwhile, Granada picked up a drama award for The Jewel in the Crown. The BBC notably didn't win anything.
Yes, there was some snotty press about that at the time. And here's big news. New presenters were announced for LWT's Game for a Laugh. Rusty Lee, Martin Daniels and Lee Peck, replacing Sarah Kennedy, Matthew Kelly and Henry Kelly.
And we're going to be talking about a double bill of female-led police shows, both of which aired on the evening of Saturday, November the 10th. First, airing at 7:10, was BBC One's Juliet Bravo, now in its 4th series, and following the travails of Anna Carteret's Inspector Kate Longton in the fictional Lancashire town of Hartley.
Then at 9:15 on ITV, London Weekend Television's The Gentle Touch, with Jill Gascoigne's Detective Inspector Maggie Forbes at the equally fictional Seven Dials Police Station in London.
And while the Juliet Bravo episode Abuse, written by Susan Pleat, looked at child abuse on a deprived local estate, The Gentle Touch's Cure by PJ Hammond is a rather more fanciful investigation into an apparent mystical healer. Now, I've got to say, I was aware of both these shows. I always remember hearing about the trails for them. They were big flagship shows. But I can't say I ever watched either of them. But I was very conscious of Juliet Bravo. The name even, it was always in my idea of this woman detective.
Yeah, I mean, actually, my house, these were mainstays. So we would definitely watch both, yes. To the point that I can remember that my dad would get furious with The Gentle Touch because William Marlowe, the actor in that, some weeks he would have a moustache and some weeks he wouldn't. And none of the other cast would comment on it. And for my dad, that would ruin the episode. He would always blow his lid and say, people would talk about that. Where's the moustache gone? Anyway, that's a small point. Yeah. But, these are both kind of bread and butter dramas. The Gentle Touch came to television a little bit sooner than Juliet Bravo. But it's interesting, isn't it, that this idea was in the air. The whole thing, I mean, from the name downwards, is about the fact that it's a female police lead. I
agree. Well, I was thinking of Angie Dickinson, Policewoman. That was a kind of late 70s thing, and I suspect that's partly what they're trying to ape. The opening credit sequence for The Gentle Touch looks like it's trying to be action-packed and American style and cashing on that kind of Cagney and Lacey heart-to-heart vibe. Yeah. I was struck by how poorly shot it is in comparison. I mean, how grey the skies. They never have a single sunny day, and every shot takes too long. Like they'll be walking upstairs to knock at someone's door, and the camera will painstakingly wait while they walk up 2 flights of steps, ring the doorbell, pause, silence, nothing happens. It's like 35 seconds of this. It's almost like they're trying to pad out the episode. That's not to knock what's attempted in the storytelling, but I was struck by how slowly paced The Gentle Touch actually was. What I did like was, considering we've just talked about the terrible misogyny in that Ray Davies film, very early on in this episode of Juliet Bravo, she picks up on some banter when there's officers hearing that she's going to see someone, a male officer, and she just shuts down the banter about flirting with not by making a big scene, but just very practically saying, no, it's not like that, in a really no-nonsense way. And I just thought how easily these shows could actually deal with the sexism without making a big deal of it.
I think the other thing I liked about Juliet Bravo is it wasn't, though, a particularly keen point with her staff, was it, that their boss is a woman? No. And actually, a lot of the men get quite what would be considered sort of quite feminine scenes, talking about childcare. And there's a really nice opening scene where there's a paperboy talking to David Ellison's Sergeant Beck about his miserable home life.
How are things now at home?
I'm still on about my marks at school. You say I'm not doing well enough.
Your mother?
No, him. He's obsessed with marks.
You know they're in danger of closing down? Cately's where he works.
Yeah.
Well, he's worried for himself, but he's worried for you too. Worries you'll not get a job. He sees you doing well at school as some sort of protection, Martin.
He makes me bend over the chair, and then he whacks me with a slipper. You say he worries about me, Mr. Beck. I can't see it.
Well, come on, you don't want to be late, do you?
And I think you hear from that this idea of, David Ellison, big sort of gruff-looking actor, and actually all of the male leads are allowed to be soft. And there's another thing, isn't there, with Sergeant George Parrish, who's looking over 2 children who they've taken from a home because they think they're abused, and he's just watching them sleeping and looking after them. It's really tender, and I really like the fact they didn't have to be sort of aggressive alphas.
I agree. I was really struck in tone by how much closer to the 1950s and the 2020s this police world is, and of course we're speaking after the latest panorama scandal over racist and misogynistic behaviour at Charing Cross Police Station. And these officers, they walk the beat, they know the local children, they've got concerns about how people are treated by social services. There's a really interesting conversation with the social worker in a sense of competing institutions.
Yes. Yeah.
And it really feels like you can see, this is an era when taxes were, I suppose, higher in many ways. You can see that people had a different expectation that the police would be there, they would intervene. Yeah. And I don't know what the police felt about the show like this, but I suspect they did a huge amount for boosting potentially women and other people, men as well, to think of the police as something that was an entirely benign force in society.
Yeah, and people are confiding in them, aren't they, and are finding them trustworthy. And it did remind me of Angels, which we talked about in our first episode from 1975. That kind of, even from the sort of strident opening titles and the you have an institutional emblem as part of the logo. And Susan Pleat, who wrote this, she did write for Angels. But it also has that thing. I think the dialogue is great. It's very clipped. It's very propulsive. But it has that thing which I think is quite an 80s drama thing, which is that almost every single line diligently informs the episode's theme, and it does make it sometimes feel a bit sort of didactic, as if no one really lives here. It
feels more like a play for today than you might expect. So there's a whole thing about the young couple who've obviously had children very young, and there's a complicated backstory that the young mother had been in foster care and obviously has attachment issues with their children, and it's shot like a play, and the conversations between this young couple are quite a more play for today territory. I also thought that went into some quite touching stuff with Kate Longton, who I do think of as Juliet Bravo. Is broody, admits to being 38 years old, doesn't have children, and it does affect how she sees these young parents and the issue of whether their children are being abused or neglected or not.
They suck you in, Inspector. They suck you into their emotional morass. Then you, I judge, you're pretty vulnerable. You're a prime candidate, I'd say.
What's that mean?
Oh, nothing. Forget it.
Please, don't stop there.
I'm married to a lady who's a speech therapist. She likes it. She's very keen. But when she hit 30, my wife never thought of having kids before she suddenly started to hang around with all her pregnant friends. This morbid fascination with other people's babies. Well, in her case, the remedy was simple.
Supply her with her own, you mean?
Exactly, yes.
How very patronising. And how very arrogant of you to think you can type people in that way. OK, I am female. I'm also 38, unmarried, childless. That doesn't mean because I'm dealing with a case of child abuse I'm unordinarily involved.
Okay.
And I thought that was really interesting. It can go into quite complicated territory. The women don't have to be perfect. I also loved, and this is something that really jumped out at me, there's a chat in the Gentle Touch episode about whether they can charge this guy they think is a bit of a charlatan faith healer. And they discuss getting him on tax like Al Capone. And that is a real strategy. And I chaired a serious organised crime conference for the Home Office after Theresa May became Prime Minister a few years ago. And it was all about, they had a load of police officers there, they had people from HMRC, and it was all about smashing gangs by getting them on things like VAT fraud or trading standards or, dumping, fly tipping, using civil agencies rather than having the burden of proof for a criminal prosecution. So I thought that was really interesting, that was a real thing being explored then.
Well, let's talk a bit more about the Gentle Touch then. So this was created by Terence Feely, who'd risen up through ITC shows and a lot of kind of Jerry and Sylvia Anderson shows.
He definitely wrote some Space 1999.
Yes, yeah. And actually, this is one of the very last episodes that was broadcast because Maggie Forbes would cross over ITV regions to join the spin-off TVS show Cat's Eyes, which was also created by Feely. In fact, pretty much as this aired, TVS announced that. They announced they're making a pilot for a 13-part detective series about 3 female undercover agents with, as we said, Jill Gascoigne still playing Maggie Forbes, Leslie Ash and Rosalind Lander.
So trying to be a bit more Charlie's Angels, am I right?
Yes. And at the time, and this is interesting because it just gives you a sense of where it was in development, executive producer Rex Firkin had said the 3 women belonged to a Home Office unit which was specially set up by women to give women a chance to get on in the force. The operation is called SOHO, Special Operations Home Office, which uses as its cover a detective agency. The series contains a lot of humour and is not nearly as serious as the usual detective series.
It's such an ITC thing to come up with an acronym like that.
Oh, isn't it?
FAB or whatever.
Yes, and then reverse engineer it. But I suppose the thing that surprised me then about the Gentle Touch, which we know which direction it's going in, and it sort of has the whiff of a more exciting, propulsive drama, is, as you were saying earlier, the energy is incredibly low, to the point that part 2 opens with a close-up of Maggie Forbes making gravy.
Yes, I know. Although that's supposed to try to show you her home life. I was really surprised at how this whole episode had a supernatural twist.
Actually, the writer for this one is PJ Hammond, who created Sapphire and Steel. So,
well, that's the other comparison I was going to make.
Did that work for you? Because they sort of vamp it up at the end, don't they? Yeah. So they're investigating this guy who might be a faith healer.
Yeah, but then they start developing their own symptoms, and there's a whole big moment at the end when he's apparently healing someone, and they both find their symptoms disappear at the same time.
We are going to force this pain out, Jamie. Now. Now! Now! I said now!
I just thought it had jumped the shark at this point.
Yes.
I think it's fair to say. It's my assessment. But I did think Jill Gascoigne was so grown up and so beautiful and so sexy. And I do remember being very aware of her in newspaper coverage and things. And she was an absolute role model because she looks like a grown-up woman. I don't know how old she was, but, you get a sense that she's in her mid-30s, not a young 20-something, the way that Charlie's Angels all looked impossibly young and beautiful. Although they were very capable, obviously.
And as we mentioned with Juliet Bravo, again, it's not really an element in this, is it? That people are going, oh, my governor's a woman. It's long gone past that in this show, which I think is great.
But you are seeing her grapple with being a wife and mother, and I like that it's sort of like it's not made a thing of. But part of the novelty is that you are watching a woman detective who is juggling some of those things that you juggle as a woman. Yeah, I just thought the series was so low energy. This episode really shocked me.
So let me ask you the really thuddingly obvious question: Juliet Bravo or The Gentle Touch, which is best?
Well, on the basis of these two episodes, Juliet Bravo.
Yeah, I think
definitely.
I agree.
So, from the unexpectedly supernatural ending of The Gentle Touch, we go to something very overtly supernatural.
If your mansion house needs haunting, just call Rentaghost. We've got spooks and ghouls and freaks and fools at Rentaghost.
Of course, that's Rentaghost, which aired on Tuesday the 6th of November at 4:35 p.m. And despite there being no reference to it in the episode itself, this turned out to be the last ever edition, bringing it to the end, a 9-series run.
And materialising here on the podcast to discuss it with us is our first ever guest, Richard Marson. Richard's a television producer, director and former editor-in-chief of Blue Peter. But more pertinently, he's also the author of an upcoming book, Box of Delights, the story of BBC children's television 1967 to 1997, which is published by 10 Acre Books on November 17th. Hello, Richard.
Hi, guys. Hi.
Can I ask first, what did you know about Rentaghost? Where does it fit into this period that you're covering?
Well, I hate to say this, but I'm old enough to remember watching the very first series of Rentaghost. I was 10 when it started, and I loved it because I loved all spooky stuff. And in fact, for my liking, I preferred it when it was slightly darker and spookier, and it got much, much more kind of pantomimey and slapstick. And of course, by then, when you get to be a slightly older child, you begin to be very snooty about kids shows and you begin to look down on them. So by the time Rentaghost came to an end, I was definitely out of sorts with it. But the other thing to say about Rentaghost is, of course, when I joined the BBC and got to know the great Jeremy Swan, who produced and directed most of Rentaghost, you can absolutely see the hallmark of his productions, which is get loads of old turns, line them up, cross-shoot them and get to the bar by 8 o'clock.
Yeah, it does look like it's shot on a stage, doesn't it? The camera's kind of locked off and you're just looking through the TV as if you're looking at a proscenium arch.
It totally is. I mean, and that's absolutely what Jeremy aimed for, partly because he came from a theatrical tradition, but also I think because it made it much more straightforward to produce. It was known for being this ferociously efficient machine, and actors had to be a bit careful because if they went slightly awry and thought there was going to be another take, there very often wasn't another take and it would just be left in.
Yeah, there's a great quote I read actually, which I think ties in with this, from Jeremy Swan. He said, "A technician once described it to me as plonky actors standing in a straight line, bawling their lines out front." And that's what I wanted, he said. So actually, he was purposely, this was his oeuvre, this was his bag. He liked this kind of entertainment.
And if you think about the other shows he did, like Galloping Galaxies and stuff like that, that was Jeremy's stock in trade.
It made me wonder who the audience was, because like you, Richard, I think we're at the same age. I started watching it when I was about 10, and it was darker and it seemed aimed at slightly older children. By the end of it, this looks like it's for very young children, because there's huge amounts of slapstick and silliness all the time.
Yeah, I watched it and I must admit I thought, I'm not sure that lots of kids would have got the puns and the kind of wordplay.
Ah, Miss Popoff, I am glad you are here. I wish to make a proposal.
Oh, darling, I thought you would never ask. Of course I accept. Then will we be married?
You do not understand. I wish to make a proposal to all of you.
But you cannot marry all three of us. That would be big of you. Big on me.
And yet the slapstick is very, very kind of young, very childish. And so, as you say, I think it might have fallen between two stools. A thing I would always taunt Jeremy with was that in those days, just by definition of being on BBC One, you'd get 8 million viewers. So I wonder whether something like Rentaghost would fly now. It would have to be much more sophisticated, I think.
The thing that struck me about it is it's a bit of a shambles, isn't it, this episode, which isn't necessarily a bad thing for a kids' comedy. But we're talking about the style of humour, and some of it is very musical. And some of the archetypes, Bob Block, who wrote it, was born in 21, but some of the archetypes are almost kind of panto. And we have this character for this series, Susie Starlight, played by Amy MacDonald. And Richard, I felt the allusions that she sort of makes and the gags that she's sort of making are much too old for this audience. And I don't mean old as in crude, but just the style of humour, this whole thing about being a slightly washed up actress and reading her reviews. And yes, what's going on there?
I can see why. I was told by one member of the production team that when they used to rehearse Rentaghost at the BBC's North Acton rehearsal rooms, the table of actors would apparently just scream with laughter all the way through lunch. And it feels like there are a lot of in-jokes in the script that the actors are relishing and really enjoying, but probably are going wide of the mark in terms of the target audience.
So, what did you make of the episode, Samira?
Well, actually, watching it, I kind of enjoyed the complete excess of it. It was out of control. It was non-stop weird music hall gags, people standing in a line like they were taking a curtain call almost. And I can imagine very small children laughing out loud at the policemen with having their hats turned to clown hats and all the rest of it. Other than that, I just guess I found it weird to think this is the same era as you get some quite... the mid of 1980s, this feels like it's from the early 1970s, and yet it's nothing like the original. And so it was quite interesting watching a whole episode from this era, because I used to stumble across the end of it, but I never used to watch it, whereas the early episodes I used to watch, I really liked. I was fascinated by the fact that Fred had died, I think, in a road crash, and the whole premise was he had to avoid his parents finding out that he was dead, which was so strange. And the three of them, they were all sort of... there was the Victorian gentleman who was also in the film The Slipper and the Rose. And the three of them were they were trapped in a kind of purgatory on Earth, weren't they?
Yes, it was very bleak. I think my understanding is that they slightly changed direction, in part because of some of those cast members died, but also ITV had started running Richard Carpenter's The Ghosts of Motley Hall, which had a similar kind of elegiac, oldie world sense to it. So there was a meeting. I think Jeremy Swan actually met Richard Carpenter, and they actually said, here's our scripts and here's your scripts, so that they weren't overlapping in what they're doing. But I think Rentaghost gave up a little bit of ground because of that.
Do you know, watching it though, it reminded me of early goodies. I used to stumble across these later episodes of Rentaghost. I was sort of teenager by then. And, the chase on the bed, the messing with the policeman, and interestingly, much more female-dominated cast now. But it really had that early goodies sense of throwing everything at it. Did they know it might be the last series? Because it feels like they deliberately just went over the top. There's a fire in the basement, it's like everything's happening.
Ironically, they didn't. As far as I know from talking to Jeremy, the reason it ended was that he left the BBC briefly to go over to ITV. And I think they did feel that after 9 series, they'd sort of said everything they could say. And so it kind of came to a natural end. But there was much less planning and thinking about that stuff. I think that really popular shows, the BBC would just sometimes stop and think, we're going to do something else. The most famous example is The Brothers, which was, ended on a cliffhanger. And they thought they would bring it back, and then they just decided they wouldn't. And there was that kind of slightly cavalier with the BBC, we can sort of do what we like.
Yeah. Graham, you observed that Crackerjack ends the following month.
Yeah, it ends in December. And also, Grandad, which was another Bob Block production, ends as well in 84.
That's Jeremy as well. So when Jeremy left, I think those projects died with him.
But what about Crackerjack?
No, well, Crackerjack wasn't made by Children's. It was made by the adult variety department, and Children's kind of bought it in from within the BBC, and it was expensive. And so that was definitely a case where they thought it's a bit dated, it costs a lot of money, it's not made within children's, let's call it a day.
So who was the head of BBC Children's at this time then, in 84?
So in 1984, it was Edward Barnes.
Right, okay. And someone like Jeremy Swan, who's a bit of an old trooper and he can get these productions together and he clearly has his kind of repertory casts, would he sort of be left to his own devices to an extent, or would the head of children's want to have an input in what they're doing and maybe give them notes and maybe say, it's looking a bit tatty, or we want more of this?
What I would say to that is that you cannot underestimate the extent to which producer directors in those days, particularly the established ones, were left to their own devices. So Jeremy, very much so. He was a kind of unit of one. He called his office Brigadoon because he said he kind of vanished into the mist and, wasn't part of the mainstream East Tower operation. He was trusted. They knew he would deliver the goods. And there was so much to do. I mean, running the children's department was a mini service in its own. They tried to replicate the service that was provided for adults, but it was all coming from one department. And Edward trusted Jeremy and would let him get on with it. But he did watch everything. He was of that era where heads of department walked the floor and watched the output. And if they liked it, they would come in and pat you on the back. And if they didn't like it, there would be a lot of effing and blinding. And it would be very open.
Is it Michael Staniforth who played Mr. Claypole? He's the kind of the one figure who runs through the whole series. And I think he performed the theme tune as well.
He did, and they had to rewrite the theme tune because the early lyrics were seen as too supernatural, so it had to be toned down.
But there's something very touching about seeing him here, because I think he died very young, didn't he, and only a few years later.
Yeah, he was one of that the lost generation to HIV/AIDS.
Yeah,
and I think he was dead within 2.5 years of the last episode of Rentaghost.
And he's also a kind of a character that, he's a historical character. He's a medieval jester. And the way that he uses his voice, I don't know, there was something about him. Seeing him still on television in 1984 was reassuring to me that Rentaghost was still going. Even as an older teenager who didn't watch children's anymore. I just loved that there was a sense of continuity, which you got with these long-running shows on the BBC in particular. Was that a thing, Richard?
That was seen as hugely important because they understood that children are conservative with a small c, and that those strands of continuity in the talent, whether it was John Craven, whether it was one of the Blue Peter presenters, someone like Tony Hart, who was on children's television for decades in different shows, but this reassuring, uncle, grandfather figure. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, Michael Staniforth was that continuity in Rentaghost, and there was something lovely about him and lovely about that performance. So seeing him there every series was a great anchor.
And you've identified something really important, I think, that is lost, which is the older, cool uncle auntie figure who's not a parent, who's not a grandparent, but is that much older.
I mean, he was a big talent, Michael Staniforth, and I read that the bikers would arrive to whisk him to the West End stage at the end of a recording of Rentaghost to make sure he was there. But why? I mean, and he's such a force of nature in this. But why didn't we see him across lots of other BBC shows, do you think?
Well, I think typecasting was a real thing. I mean, he was a musical theatre actor first and foremost, as you say. He was doing the first production of Starlight Express around this time, and he was a kind of go-to guy for a first company in the West End. I think that was possibly his first love as well. I think that was where he was probably at his happiest. I'm sure he wouldn't have said no if someone had offered him a 9 o'clock BBC Two gig, but things were very siloed in terms of acting then. I mean, actors then thought much more in terms of, if I do this show, I really will be typed, and he did that show for 9 years, so I think that would have been a problem.
Tell us about your book, The Box of Delights. What was the impetus? Because there's a lot of publications about children's television out there. They're usually either thoroughly researched but using secondhand sources, or they're a kind of a nostalgic reverie. And my sense here is that actually you seem to want to have done a thing where you've basically gone and spoken to everyone instead. Was that your starting point here?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of doing that kind of work. So there are over 170 interviews for this book. And I also had a really strong sense that I wanted to capture the generation that had made these programmes. It's a period of history that
was relatively short. I mean, it's 3 decades, and that's when it began to kind of unravel in the wake of new technology and competition and so on. But they had this kind of nirvana period where there was intense creativity on all fronts and this constant expansion and an extraordinary collection of individuals. I love that Richard Stilgoe said to me, the thing about people who worked well in children's programs is that they were all quite childish. So they were a nightmare in a meeting or a nightmare to be managed by, but they were brilliant when they were given their head and allowed to go off and actually make programs, and they were. And I was very conscious that that generation are not really going to be with us for very much longer. Most of the contributors are in their 70s, 80s, and even 90s. And the wonderful thing about talking to people of that generation is that they no longer feel like they have to play by some kind of code book of, not that I was sort of fishing for gossip, but they're able to be frank and they're able to be analytical. These are very bright, interesting, imaginative people. So there are great stories. And I felt like it was really worth trying to capture that directly from those people and then putting it in the So the other bit of the work is doing the research into the paperwork. So, the stuff at the BBC Written Archive and things, because you have to contextualize. And also sometimes, of course, you've got to course correct because people's memories will deviate and all that. And the great thing was I was able to go back to a lot of people when that happened. And I would say, well, look, I found this memo or this has come across, or somebody else says this, because the other value is in having not a consensus, but a range of opinions around certain key shows and certain key developments, so that it's not one voice, it's not my voice, or it's not the producer. You get a perspective that includes writers, designers, actors, presenters, and it was a community. So that felt authentic to reflect that.
I suppose if we could, there was one question to end on with you, Richard, is people often talk about, the 70s and 80s as this golden age of BBC television, of children's television. Do you think that's true? Or are we always nostalgic for the era we grew up in?
Well, I think that's a good point. I mean, nostalgia is a powerful driver, and it's the old conversation that you hear. So many adults will start in a pub or a dinner and they'll say, what do you remember when you were watching kids' TV? And the conversations quickly become very heated because, people have this kind of absolute passion for the things they grew up with and they think everything that followed is rubbish. I'm very, very wary of golden age kind of appellations. I think there was a lot of dross, and also there was a fair amount of dross even among the programmes that were, outstanding in some respects. So you could get some very boring episodes of Blue Peter or Record Breakers, some very tatty episodes of Play School. I mean, because a lot of the time they were being made by trainees as well, or old timers who were literally kind of waiting for the final check to come in. So you can't generalize, but when it worked, when they did something fabulous, or really ambitious, like The Changes, the 10-part science fiction serial all on film, which was incredibly dystopian for children's TV in 1975. And, I looked back at some of those things and you think the impact that made and the kind of chutzpah of these people saying, we're going to give kids the absolute best we can across all genre. And that is true.
Richard Marson, thank you so much.
Next month, we're doing something a little different. It's Christmas, Samira, and so we're going to be unwrapping our favourite and least favourite festive television shows of all time.
And we're in the company of a special guest, Mark Gatiss, who loves Christmas television too. If you've got your own thoughts on best and worst Christmas TV or anything from today's episode, please do drop us a line on email at squarewindow.co.uk.
Goodbye.
Thanks for listening to Through the Square Window. This was a Square Window production with music by local teenagers. The podcast logo was designed by Stuart Manning, and the voice of Bob Monkhouse was provided by me, Simon Cartwright, currently playing Bob on stage in The Last Laugh. Visit thelastlaughplay.co.uk for more details. Funny, isn't it? You start out life trying to get noticed, but in the end, well, you're just glad if you're remembered. Goodbye.